My son Nathan sat in the lawyer's office with a smug smile, certain that I would walk away with nothing from my ex-husband's $42 million estate. In his eyes, I was just a forgotten schoolteacher, a woman who had given up everything for family and been discarded like an old coat when Charles rose to power. Nathan had worshipped his father's ambition, despised my simplicity, and now, dressed in his designer suit, he waited to hear confirmation that the empire was his alone. But when the lawyer adjusted his glasses and read one single sentence, the air shifted. To my former wife, Clara Price, I bequeath the sum of $41 million and controlling interest in Price Construction. The words dropped like a thunderclap. Nathan's grin cracked, then shattered completely. His face turned red. His fists slammed the mahogany table, and his voice rose so violently that the windows seemed to tremble. "What? This is fraud! She doesn't deserve a cent!" I sat frozen, my heart hammering. For decades I had been dismissed, overlooked, and humiliated. Now, with one stroke of ink, Charles had handed me not only unimaginable wealth, but also the power to finally decide the legacy of the man who once abandoned me. I wasn't always Clara Price, the woman people whispered about at the funeral as if I were some kind of ghost from a forgotten life. Long before the headlines praised Charles as a visionary builder, before the millions and the marble offices, there was just Charles and me, two college kids in Wyoming who dreamed of making something of ourselves. I was 19 when I met him. He carried himself with the confidence of a man twice his age, speaking about architecture as if he had been born with blueprints in his veins. I was studying literature, dreaming of becoming a teacher, and what struck me most wasn't his ambition, but the way he listened when I spoke. Charles would sit across from me in the library, rough pencil sketches spread across the table, while I recited lines from Whitman or Dickinson. He said my words gave him balance. We married young. Our wedding was simple. A church basement decorated with flowers my mother had arranged, a rented suit, and a promise whispered under a starlit sky. I believed him when he said we'd always put love first. And for a time, we did. We lived in a tiny apartment with cracked linoleum floors and a second-hand couch, surviving on coffee, determination, and the stubborn belief that we could weather anything. When Nathan was born, I thought my life had found its perfect center. I quit graduate school to stay home with him, pouring myself into late-night feedings and lullabies, believing that supporting Charles's long hours at the construction firm was part of the bargain. He'd come home exhausted, dust clinging to his boots, but his eyes lit up when he held our baby. In those moments, I thought we were unstoppable, but ambition has a way of eating everything around it. As Charles's company grew, so did the distance between us. Dinners turned into meetings, anniversaries into business trips. I would sit alone at the kitchen table, the candles burning low, telling myself it was only temporary, that all his sacrifices were for us, for Nathan's future. The cracks widened when Nathan turned 10. Charles bought him a suit for his birthday instead of a bicycle. He needs to look the part, he said, adjusting the lapels on a boy who still had missing teeth. I wanted to take Nathan fishing that summer, to let him scrape his knees and chase fireflies. Charles scoffed. Fishing won't build his empire. By then, even my career had slipped away. I'd taken a teaching job at the local school, grateful for the steady paycheck, but every parent-teacher night I attended alone felt like a quiet humiliation. The other mothers would arrive with their husbands, polished and proud. I came with tired eyes, carrying both parental roles, whispering excuses for why Charles couldn't make it, and then came the betrayal. A glossy magazine printed a photo of Charles on the arm of a younger woman at a gala in Denver. "An old friend," he insisted when I confronted him, his eyes avoiding mine. "But old friends don't wear matching evening gowns or stand so close their champagne glasses nearly touch." Within months, he moved out, claiming he needed space. The divorce papers arrived soon after. I received the old house on Pine Street and a modest settlement, barely enough to keep Nathan and me afloat. He received everything else: the company, the properties, the empire. Nathan, caught between us, gravitated toward the sparkle of his father's success. "Mom doesn't understand," he'd mutter, echoing Charles's dismissive tone. Soon, he stopped coming home for weekends altogether, preferring penthouse views and luxury vacations over my modest dinners and second-hand furniture. Life became a long series of small humiliations. I clipped coupons, drove a rusted sedan that groaned in the winter, and taught classes full of teenagers who sometimes sneered at my worn shoes. Bills piled up faster than I could pay them, and every time I saw a headline about Charles's new skyscraper or charitable foundation, a quiet bitterness tightened in my chest. Still, I endured. I woke at 5 every morning, grading essays by lamplight before catching the bus to school. I smiled through parent conferences and baked cookies for bake sales, pretending not to notice the pitying glances when people realized Nathan was rarely by my side. At night, I stitched up the holes in my coat, whispered prayers for strength, and reminded myself that dignity couldn't be repossessed, no matter how little else I had. I told myself I had no regrets, that my love for Nathan and my commitment to my students were enough. But in the darkest moments, when the loneliness pressed hardest against my chest, I wondered if I had wasted my life believing in promises that ambition had burned to ash. And yet, even in those years of scarcity and humiliation, I never imagined what Charles would leave behind for me. Never imagined that one day, decades after he turned his back, I would sit across from my son in a lawyer's office and hear that everything, the empire, the fortune, the legacy, would come to me. The world saw Charles Price as the man who built skyscrapers. But in that polished lawyer's office, with the will spread open on the mahogany desk, the empire he left behind now bore my name. $41 million. Controlling interest in his company. Words so surreal they felt like lines from a novel. Yet, even as Nathan's outraged voice thundered in my ears, I found myself thinking about the classroom where I had spent the last 20 years, the chipped desks, the chalk dust clinging to my skirts, the students who stayed behind after class because no one else believed they could succeed. That was my real empire. No marble buildings, no gala dinners, just the small victories of teaching a child to read, of convincing a teenager he had value when the world said otherwise. When Charles left me, I thought my life had ended. The settlement was modest, the old house drafty, the car unreliable. But I discovered something extraordinary in those lean years. I could survive without him. I could build meaning out of scraps. Every coupon clipped, every essay graded, every quiet evening spent with a library book instead of a glittering party was a stone in the foundation of a different kind of success. So when the lawyer declared me heir to a fortune, I did not feel the triumph Nathan expected. I felt a strange, quiet irony. I had already succeeded in the one way Charles never could. I had built a life that didn't collapse when the applause stopped. My neighbors knew me not as the ex-wife of a billionaire, but as Clara, the woman who shoveled her own snow at dawn, who brought soup when someone fell ill, who always had a kind word at the corner store. Success had never been in dollars. It had been in dignity. And now, by some twist of fate, the two had collided. I looked at Nathan across the desk. His jaw was clenched, his eyes wild with betrayal. He had been groomed his whole life to inherit wealth, to believe money was love, power was respect. And yet, it was handed to me, the woman he considered irrelevant, invisible, defeated. The irony burned through him, but for me, it brought clarity. I did not need Charles's millions to validate who I was. I already knew, but perhaps, with this inheritance, I could do something Charles never did. Use power not to dominate, but to restore, to give back. In that sense, my present success was not the windfall itself. It was the chance to finally align recognition with reality, that the woman who had been left behind, ridiculed, underestimated, had endured. And endurance, I realized, is its own kind of wealth. The empire was mine now, yes, but my truest inheritance was something I had carried all along, the unshakable knowledge that I had already won the moment I refused to break. The lawyer's words had barely settled into the silence of the room when Nathan exploded. His chair screeched against the polished floor as he stood, his fists trembling at his sides. "This is a mistake," he shouted, his face red with fury. "It's fraud. She doesn't deserve a dime, let alone my father's company." My breath caught. Even after everything, hearing him call me she instead of mother cut deeper than the sharpest blade. The lawyer, Mr. Grant, adjusted his glasses calmly, as though this kind of eruption was part of his daily routine. "Nathan, I assure you, the documents were prepared under your father's direct supervision. He was of sound mind. Every detail was verified and witnessed." But Nathan wasn't listening. His eyes locked on me, blazing with the kind of anger I had only ever seen in Charles during his worst moments. "You did this," he spat. "You manipulated him. Somehow, you got to him before he died. Admit it." "I hadn't spoken to your father in years," I said quietly, my voice trembling but steady enough to carry across the room. "I didn't even know he was ill. This was his choice." "Choice?" Nathan barked out a bitter laugh. "You are nothing to him. Nothing. He left you with scraps while he built an empire with me by his side. And now you expect me to believe he handed all of it over to a washed-up schoolteacher?" The word stung, but I didn't flinch. I had been called worse. "Nathan," the lawyer interjected, "your father left you a substantial inheritance as well. The house, the trust account." "Spare me," Nathan snapped, cutting him off. "A house and some pocket change compared to this?" He pointed at the thick file on the desk, the one containing the lines that had changed both our lives. "He betrayed me. He betrayed his own son." I wanted to reach for him, to remind him that before the suits and the arrogance, he had once been a boy who sat on my lap while I read him bedtime stories. But the boy I remembered was gone, replaced by a man who saw me only as an obstacle standing between him and power. "You think this makes you something?" he sneered at me. "You think sitting here with your name on paper makes you worthy? You'll destroy everything he built. You don't have the slightest idea how to run a company." For a moment, I almost believed him. The weight of it all, the millions, the corporate responsibilities, the employees who depended on those paychecks, pressed down on me like a boulder. But then I remembered the decades I had carried far heavier burdens, raising a child alone, stretching dollars until they screamed, standing tall while the world pitied or mocked me. "I may not know business," I said softly, "but I know perseverance. I know integrity. Those were things your father once admired, even if he forgot them. Nathan's face twisted, a storm of rage and disbelief. No, he wouldn't have chosen you over me. You're lying? He was tricked. The lawyer cleared his throat, his tone deliberate. Your father also left a personal letter addressed to both of you. His instructions were clear that it be read immediately after the will. Nathan froze, his hands clenched into fists so tight the knuckles turned white. A letter? Mr. Grant reached for an envelope, its cream-colored paper marked with Charles's familiar handwriting. He slid it carefully from the file, unfolded the pages, and began to read. My dearest Clara, and my son Nathan. The sound of Charles's words filled the room, and for a moment time seemed to bend backward. It was as if he were alive again, his deep voice echoing through the walls, explaining himself in the only way left to him. He admitted his failures, abandoning me, chasing ambition at the cost of family, raising Nathan to value profit over people. He confessed that he had always admired the strength I showed in silence, the way I endured with dignity even when he left me behind. And then came the line that shattered Nathan's composure. Nathan, I leave you a home and the means to live well, but not the empire. You are not ready. Wealth without wisdom destroys more than it builds. Clara has what you lack: character, patience, and the courage to stand alone. Nathan's breath came ragged, his chest heaving. No, he whispered. No, he wouldn't say that. But the words hung there, undeniable. As Mr. Grant folded the letter back into its envelope, Nathan turned on me again, his face twisted with pain and fury. You took him from me. You poisoned him against me. Tears pricked my eyes, but not for myself, for him. For the boy I had lost. For the man who had built his entire identity on an inheritance that now slipped through his fingers. I didn't take anything from you, Nathan, I whispered. Your father gave me this, not to punish you, but to save you. One day, you'll understand. But he wasn't ready to hear it. He stormed out of the office, slamming the door so hard the walls rattled, leaving behind only the echo of his anger and the shadow of betrayal that would not easily fade. I sat in the silence that followed, the letter heavy in my hands. For years, I had lived as if forgotten. And now, with Charles's final words, I realized I had not only been remembered, I had been chosen. But the cost was Nathan's hatred, sharper than any knife. The son I had once cradled in my arms had become my greatest adversary. The days after the will reading felt like walking through a fog, each step heavy with disbelief. $41 million? Controlling interest in a construction empire. These were numbers and responsibilities that belonged to another world, not to a woman who had spent her life clipping coupons and staying late in classrooms that smelled of chalk and pencil shavings. The morning after, I woke up in my modest Pine Street home, sunlight spilling across the faded curtains, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But then my eyes landed on the cream-colored envelope lying on the table, Charles's final letter. His words were real. His choice was real. And whether I felt ready or not, the world expected me to step into a role I had never asked for. The first test came sooner than I imagined. A call from the board of directors at Price Construction. The voice on the other end was polite but firm. Mrs. Price, as majority shareholder, we require your presence at the next board meeting. There are pending contracts that need your signature. My hand tightened around the receiver. My presence? My signature? I hadn't been in a corporate office in over 30 years. I agreed, though my voice trembled. After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long while, staring at my hands. These hands had graded thousands of essays, planted flowers in a small patch of soil, stitched Nathan's torn shirts when he was a boy. Now they were supposed to sign documents worth millions. The weight of it made me dizzy. When I arrived at the headquarters 2 days later, the building loomed like a fortress of glass and steel, towering above the streets of downtown. Price Construction's name gleamed in silver letters across the entrance. I hesitated at the revolving door, feeling like an intruder. Inside, the lobby buzzed with activity, men in tailored suits, women in sleek dresses tapping away on tablets, their heels clicking across marble floors. I walked slowly, my thrift store coat and sensible shoes standing out like a relic among artifacts of wealth. At the reception desk, the young woman looked at me with polite confusion until I gave my name. Her eyes widened, and suddenly she was on her feet, ushering me toward the elevators with nervous respect. "This way, Mrs. Price. The board is waiting." The meeting room was a cavern of mahogany and glass, a long, polished table surrounded by people who had likely spent more on their watches than I had on my entire wardrobe. They rose politely when I entered, but their eyes betrayed skepticism. To them, I wasn't a leader. I was a question mark, a test. "Mrs. Price," said a man at the head of the table, Mr. Whitman, the acting CEO. His hair was silver, his suit impeccable, his voice measured. "We offer our condolences for your loss. We also extend our support as you transition into this role. But of course, there are practical matters to address." He slid a stack of contracts toward me, pages thick with legal jargon. "These projects were approved by your late husband. They require your confirmation." I scanned the pages, my eyes swimming. Engineering terms, cost analyses, projected revenue streams, and alien language. The room was silent, every gaze waiting to see if I would falter. I set the papers down. "Mr. Whitman," I said carefully, "I appreciate your work, but I won't sign anything I don't understand. If these projects are sound, explain them to me in plain language. If not, they will wait." A murmur rippled through the room. Some exchanged glances, a few smiled faintly as if amused. But Whitman inclined his head, respect flickering in his eyes. "Of course. That is your right as chairwoman." The meeting dragged on for hours, each project broken down, each contract questioned. I listened, asked clumsy but honest questions, and slowly pieced together fragments of understanding. By the end, I signed only one document, the one I felt certain about. The others I postponed. It was my first small act of authority, shaky but firm. That evening, as I left the building, Nathan was waiting outside. His suit gleamed under the streetlights, his jaw set hard. "You think this makes you powerful?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. "Sitting at that table, pretending you belong?" I swallowed. "I don't pretend, Nathan. I'm here because your father put me here." "He was wrong," Nathan hissed. "And I'll prove it. You don't have the knowledge, the experience, the vision. You'll destroy everything he built, and I won't let you." The cold fury in his voice chilled me more than the wind. I saw in his eyes not just anger, but calculation. My son was preparing for battle, and I was his enemy. The very next morning, whispers began. Reporters called, neighbors asked questions, even former students stopped me in the street. Headlines appeared online. "Ex-wife inherits empire. Can she handle it?" Nathan, I soon learned, had begun quietly rallying support among shareholders, painting me as an unfit leader. It was the beginning of his campaign to strip me of everything Charles had given me. But I wasn't the same woman Charles had abandoned decades ago. Life had tested me too many times, and though I trembled, I did not break. Each day became another trial, learning, questioning, enduring the cold stares of those who doubted me. And each night, alone in my modest kitchen, I unfolded Charles's letter and read his words again. Clara has what you lack: character, patience, and the courage to stand alone. It was a test, I realized, not just from Nathan, not just from the board, but from life itself. And this time, I would not fail. In the weeks that followed, the tension inside Price Construction thickened like storm clouds. Every board meeting, every staff gathering carried an undercurrent of whispers. People glanced at me with polite respect, but behind their eyes I saw doubt, and behind their doubt I sensed Nathan's hand. Rumors reached me in fragments, anonymous emails suggesting contracts had been mishandled. A secretary who lowered her voice to tell me certain reports had gone missing. A foreman who pulled me aside in the hallway and muttered, "Watch your son. He's not just angry. He's planning something." At first, I resisted believing it. Nathan was my son. Yes, he was furious. Yes, he despised me. But could he really be working to undermine me so soon? But then, one evening, I returned to my Pine Street home to find an envelope slipped under my door. Inside were photocopies, financial statements from Price Construction. Red flags leapt off the page: inflated costs, payments routed through shell companies, invoices approved with Nathan's digital signature. My hands trembled as I studied the pages under the yellow lamplight of my kitchen. If these documents were real, Nathan wasn't just trying to discredit me. He was siphoning money out of the company itself. The next morning, I took the folder to Mr. Grant, the lawyer who had read Charles's will. His office smelled of leather and old books, the heavy curtains blocking out the summer sun. I slid the papers across his desk. My voice hushed. "I don't know if these are authentic, but if they are, Nathan is bleeding the company dry." Grant examined the documents, his brow furrowing. "These aren't amateur forgeries," he said finally. "They match the style of Price Construction's internal records. Where did you get them?" "I don't know," I admitted. "They were left at my door." "That means someone on the inside is feeding you information," he said. "Which also means others are aware of what Nathan is doing. But be cautious, Mrs. Price. These are serious accusations, and if you confront him without proof, he'll turn it against you." Proof. That was the key. I left his office with the papers hidden in my bag, my mind racing. If I wanted to protect Charles's legacy, if I wanted to honor the trust he placed in me, I needed more than rumors and anonymous documents. I needed solid evidence. So I began to watch, to listen, to learn. I made unannounced visits to project sites, dressed plainly so workers would speak freely. At first, they eyed me warily, but when I asked questions not about profit margins, but about safety, hours, and fair pay, their suspicions softened. Bit by bit, they told me things they wouldn't say in boardrooms, that Nathan had pressured them to sign off on deliveries never received, that subcontractors had complained about payments delayed, only to be replaced by new companies with unfamiliar names. At night, I stayed up late at my kitchen table, poring over binders of reports the board had reluctantly provided. The numbers didn't add up. Too many projects went over budget without explanation. Too many consulting fees routed through accounts no one could clearly define. The more I read, the clearer it became. Nathan wasn't preparing for leadership, He was preparing to strip the company bare before I could take control. One evening, exhausted and bleary-eyed, I stumbled across a line item buried deep in an expense report. A payment to Summit Strategies, LLC. The name tugged at my memory. 2 days later, I found it again, tied to another inflated invoice. Curious, I searched through more records. Summit Strategies appeared again and again, always attached to Nathan's approvals. When I asked the finance director about the company, he looked startled. Summit Strategies? They're a consulting partner. What kind of consulting? I pressed. His hesitation told me everything. That's Nathan's domain. He handles them personally. That night, I called Grant again. He promised to discreetly investigate Summit Strategies. 2 days later, he called back with a tone that made my stomach drop. Mrs. Price, Summit Strategies doesn't exist. At least, not as a legitimate consulting firm. It's a shell company registered in Delaware 6 months ago. Guess whose name is on the documents? I didn't need him to say it. Nathan. The truth settled over me like ice. My son wasn't just scheming against me. He was committing fraud, using his position in the company to funnel money into his own pockets. Still, I hesitated. This was my child. The baby I had sung to sleep. The boy who had once held my hand as we crossed the street. Every instinct screamed to protect him, to confront him privately, to beg him to stop before it was too late. But then I thought of Charles's letter. Wealth without wisdom destroys more than it builds. Clara has what you lack: character, patience, and the courage to stand alone. Charles hadn't given me this inheritance to coddle Nathan's greed. He had given it to me to protect the company, to right the wrongs he himself had once ignored. So I resolved to continue gathering evidence, quietly, methodically. I met with auditors under the guise of reviewing company health. I spoke to employees who had been silenced, promising them confidentiality. I kept every scrap of information, every forged invoice, every suspicious transfer, in a locked drawer in my bedroom. And still, Nathan grew bolder. At the next board meeting, he accused me outright of incompetence. She doesn't understand the business, he declared, his voice carrying across the polished table. She's jeopardizing everything our father built. I stayed silent, letting his words hang in the air. But inside, my resolve hardened. The louder he shouted, the more desperate he became. He was bluffing, buying time while he drained the company dry. And soon, I would have the proof to silence him. The first test of motherhood is protecting your child. The last, I realized with a heavy heart, may be protecting the world from what your child has become. The locked drawer in my bedroom had become heavier than stone. Inside lay contracts, invoices, and bank records, all pointing to Nathan's betrayal. Every time I opened it, the truth screamed louder. My son was draining Charles's company through shell corporations, twisting the very empire he believed was his birthright. But evidence alone meant nothing without a plan. If I confronted him directly, he would deny, twist, accuse me of fraud. If I revealed everything to the board without preparation, half of them, loyal to Nathan, would side with him and paint me as an unstable widow clinging to scraps of power. No, this had to be precise, careful, undeniable. The first step was finding allies. I returned to Mr. Grant, sliding another stack of papers across his desk. His eyes scanned the documents, his jaw tightening with each line. "This is enough to launch an internal investigation," he said. "But if you want it to hold in court, we'll need testimony, not just numbers." Testimony. Real voices, That meant employees. So I began to reach out quietly, one by one. The foreman who had whispered warnings, the secretary who had noticed missing files, a finance clerk who had confided in me about late-night changes to the accounts. At first, they hesitated. Nathan was powerful, and fear clung to them like smoke. But when I promised confidentiality, when I reminded them that their jobs, their families, their futures depended on saving the company from collapse, their courage flickered to life. They gave me stories. A project manager told me about being forced to sign off on phantom deliveries. An engineer described being sidelined after questioning inflated budgets. The finance clerk, trembling, confessed that Nathan had asked her to adjust records in exchange for a promotion. Each story became another thread, weaving a net strong enough to catch him. But I needed more than whispers. I needed a stage. That's when I remembered the upcoming shareholder meeting. Every year, investors gathered in a grand ballroom to hear reports, review numbers, and celebrate growth. This year, Nathan had been preparing to present himself as the natural heir, the confident leader ready to take the reins from his late father's empire. It would be his coronation, unless I turned it into his downfall. The idea took root and grew. What better place to reveal the truth than in front of the very people Nathan sought to impress? A private confrontation could be silenced, but a public reckoning would be impossible to bury. Still, the thought twisted my heart. This was my son, my Nathan. I could still see him at 6 years old, running through the yard in shoes too big, laughing as I chased him with a garden hose. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who would rather see me ruined than admit his own corruption. Late at night, I sat at my kitchen table, the drawer of evidence open before me, and wrote out my plan, step by step. Step 1. Organize the documents, with duplicates hidden safely with Mr. Grant in case Nathan tried to destroy them. Step 2. Secure testimony in writing from at least 3 employees, notarized and protected. Step 3. Prepare my own statement, clear, measured, undeniable. Not as a grieving ex-wife, not as a naive schoolteacher, but as the majority shareholder and rightful chairwoman of Price Construction. The hardest step was emotional. I had to accept that Nathan would see this not as justice, but as betrayal. He would look at me not as a mother, but as an enemy. I wept quietly the night that truth settled into my bones, but when the tears dried, resolve remained. Charles had trusted me for a reason. I could not fail him, or the hundreds of employees who depended on this company to feed their families. The days leading up to the shareholder meeting were a blur of preparation. Grant worked tirelessly, coordinating with auditors and ensuring every document was airtight. The employees willing to testify met with him discreetly, their fear giving way to determination. I rehearsed my statement aloud until my voice no longer trembled, until each word carried the weight of certainty. Nathan, meanwhile, grew louder. He paraded through the office halls, boasting about the future, mocking me openly in front of staff. "She's too old," he said once, his voice carrying through the corridor. "Too fragile to run a business. After the meeting, everyone will see where the real power lies." His arrogance confirmed what I already knew. He had no idea I was ready to strike. The night before the meeting, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, the same hum that had kept me company through years of loneliness. My heart ached, not from fear of what was to come, but from grief for what had been lost. I would never again be just Nathan's mother. After tomorrow, I would be his adversary in full. Still, when dawn broke and sunlight crept across the floor, I rose with steady hands. I pressed my one good suit, the navy one I had worn to the funeral, and pinned back my silver hair. In the mirror, I saw not the weary schoolteacher the world had dismissed, but a woman ready for battle. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving myself to Nathan or the board. It was about justice. For the company, for the employees, and perhaps even for Charles, whose final act had given me the strength to stand here now. I gathered the folders of evidence, slid them into a leather case Mr. Grant had lent me, and whispered a prayer. Tomorrow, under the chandeliers and the watchful eyes of hundreds, the truth would come to light. And when it did, Nathan would learn the hardest lesson of all. That character, not entitlement, decides who holds power. The ballroom of the Rock Springs Grand Hotel shimmered with chandeliers, every table draped in linen, every chair filled with investors and executives. Price Construction's annual shareholder meeting had always been a celebration of profit, a performance of confidence. This year, it was Nathan's stage. He strode across the dais in a tailored charcoal suit, his voice strong, his gestures practiced. Charts flashed on the giant screen behind him. Growth projections, expansion plans, promises of a future even brighter than his father's. The crowd nodded, murmurs of approval weaving through the air. I sat near the back, my leather case resting against my legs, my heart pounding so loudly I wondered if others could hear it. Every instinct told me to leave, to retreat, to spare myself the humiliation of becoming the target of Nathan's inevitable scorn. But then, Charles's words whispered in my memory. Clara has what you lack: character, patience, and the courage to stand alone. So I stayed. At the end of his presentation, Nathan raised a hand, the room falling silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "as you know, my father built this company into a pillar of strength. And now, with your support, I intend to continue his legacy as the rightful leader of Price Construction." Applause swelled, thunderous and confident. Nathan's smile widened. He thought he had already won. But when the applause faded, Mr. Grant stood. His calm voice cut through the air. "Before any motions are carried, the chairwoman of Price Construction has requested to address the assembly." A hush rippled through the ballroom. All eyes turned toward me. I rose slowly, clutching the case like a lifeline, and made my way to the podium. Nathan's smile faltered. "Mother," he said through gritted teeth, his microphone catching the edge of his hiss. "Don't do this." But I did. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice wavering for only a moment before steadying. "I am Clara Price, majority shareholder and chairwoman of this company. For weeks now, I've listened, I've learned, and I've watched. And today, I must speak the truth." Whispers flickered through the crowd. Nathan stepped closer, his face tight with panic. "This is inappropriate. She doesn't know what she's talking about." I opened the case and lifted out the first folder. "These are financial statements from the past year," I said clearly. "Documents showing inflated invoices, payments to shell corporations, and funds diverted away from this company." Gasps rose. I held up the second folder. "And here, witness testimony. Employees pressured to sign false reports. Staff silenced when they asked questions." Nathan lunged forward. "Lies!" His voice cracked with desperation. "Fabrications meant to embarrass me." I met his eyes, my heart breaking even as my voice hardened. "These documents bear your signature, Nathan. These transfers lead directly to an entity you control, Summit Strategies, LLC, registered under your name. The room erupted, voices shouting, chairs scraping, investors turning to one another in disbelief. Cameras flashed as reporters scribbled furiously. Nathan's composure shattered. "She's senile. She doesn't understand corporate law. She forged them. She's trying to steal what's mine." Mr. Grant stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "The documents have been verified. Independent auditors confirm their authenticity, and the shareholders deserve to see them." He laid copies on the long table where the board sat, their hands already reaching for the evidence. Nathan's face drained of color. His mouth opened and closed, searching for words, but the room was no longer his. Investors poured over the papers, whispers rising to accusations. Fraud. Theft. Betrayal. I gripped the podium, my voice firm. This company was built on ambition, but ambition without integrity destroys more than it builds. Charles trusted me with this legacy because he knew it must be protected, not plundered. I will not allow my son or anyone to drag Price Construction into ruin. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the clicks of cameras. Then applause began, not loud at first, but steady, growing, rolling across the ballroom like a wave. It wasn't universal. Some sat frozen, others whispered in unease, but enough hands clapped to make my heart swell with resolve. Nathan stood rigid, his fists clenched, his eyes burning holes through me. For a moment, he looked less like a businessman and more like a cornered child, furious that the game had not gone his way. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice low but shaking. Then he stormed from the stage, the echo of the ballroom doors slamming behind him, punctuating his fall. I remained at the podium, my breath trembling, my body drained. But as I looked out at the faces, some skeptical, some supportive, all now aware of the truth, I felt something shift. For the first time, they saw me not as a discarded wife, not as an aging schoolteacher, but as the woman who had stood her ground, who had chosen integrity over fear. And that was the beginning of everything. The morning after the shareholder meeting, headlines blazed across every local paper. "Chairwoman exposes fraud inside Price Construction. Son of late mogul under investigation for embezzlement." My phone rang without pause. Reporters demanding comment, employees offering cautious words of support, lawyers confirming the board had voted to launch a full-scale audit. For the first time in decades, I wasn't invisible. The world was watching me. Nathan, too, was everywhere in the news. His polished smile had been replaced by grainy photographs of him storming out of the ballroom. The words fraud and embezzlement followed his name like shadows. The authorities opened an inquiry within days, freezing several of his accounts, demanding he surrender company property tied to Summit Strategies. The board, shaken but determined, rallied around me. Mr. Whitman, once skeptical, now spoke with quiet respect. "Mrs. Price," he said at our next meeting, "your actions saved this company from collapse. The employees, the investors, they see you differently now." Still, the cost weighed heavily. Nathan refused to answer my calls. When I tried to reach him, the only response was silence, or worse, lawyers speaking on his behalf. The boy I had raised was gone, and the man left in his place wanted nothing to do with me. That wound was deeper than any headline, yet there were glimmers of hope. Employees who once avoided me now stopped in hallways to thank me. A young engineer shook my hand and whispered, "We needed someone to stand up for us." For the first time, I understood what Charles might have seen in me at the end. not just endurance, but the ability to lead. At home on Pine Street, the life I'd lived for decades felt almost unreal. My kitchen table, where I had once graded papers and stitched torn clothes, was now buried under legal briefs and business reports. My old life hadn't vanished. It had transformed. I was still Clara, the teacher, the mother. But I was also something more now. A woman carrying an empire on her shoulders. The consequences were undeniable. Nathan faced investigation. The company faced scrutiny, and I faced the heavy, lonely burden of leadership. But beneath it all lay something unexpected: clarity. For years, I had believed I was forgotten, cast aside. But Charles's final act, and my decision to fight, proved otherwise. The world knew my name again. And this time, I would decide what it stood for. The world outside still whispered about betrayal and inheritance, about how the son of a mogul had fallen, and how his mother had risen from the shadows. But in the quiet of my Pine Street home, I sat alone, Charles's final letter resting in my lap. His words lingered. "Clara, you have the courage to stand alone." Nathan's fate remained uncertain. Investigations would drag on for months, maybe years. Perhaps one day he would face me again, not as an enemy, but as the son I still prayed for in the silence of the night. Until then, I carried both the empire and the ache of motherhood side by side. As I looked out the window at the dawn breaking over Rock Springs, I realized this was not an ending. It was a beginning. A new chapter where I would decide how power was used, how legacy was defined, how character outweighed ambition. And so, I whispered to myself, as much a promise as a warning: this story isn't finished. Not yet. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories like this. Stories of betrayal, justice, and the strength it takes to rise when the world tries to silence you.